The past can be brutal to like everyone, especially when you're on Fear Street. And for the third time, Slappy would never. In Fear Street Part 3, 1666, the origin of Sarah's curse are finally revealed as history comes full circle on a night that changes the lives of Shadysiders forever. Fear Street 1666 starts out very bleak, like it is depressing. It's a stylistic departure from the first two installments that will probably garner comparisons to The Witch and The Crucible. It's a period colonial horror for a good amount of the movie. This is less slasher and jump scares and more eerie and folklore heavy. If period horror pieces from like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s aren't really your thing, then you may not really be feeling a good chunk of this third installment. Fear Street 1666 continues to face the brutality of death and violence head on and the ramifications it can bring about. Answers are given and everything culminates for some satisfying payoffs in the end of it all. Hey Twisted people, it's your Twisted Woman here, Chauncey K. Robinson, and today I am doing a spoiler-free review of Fear Street Part 3, 1666. But before we get into all of that, I want you to tell me what is your favorite horror movie that takes place in the distant past. I'm talking period horror movies from like the 1500s, 1600s, even BC if you want to go that far. Are there horror movies that deal with BC? I don't know, but let me know. Comment down below. I think the main thing anyone who has watched Part 1 and Part 2 and gone this far will be concerned with is if the payoff is worth it. If you went through all of this, and if you want to check out my first two reviews, I really did think the first two movies were great movies in and of themselves. But let's be real here, there is an overarching storyline happening and a big mystery when it comes to what is happening in Shadyside. And the question then is there a payoff? Well, in my opinion, I think the payoff is truly satisfying. I think there's big payoffs to be had with how everything comes together, what it all was about, and then some smaller payoffs if you were paying attention to certain characters and things that were happening throughout Part 1 and 2. So in that case, I will say if you're following this story through for the story itself to see where it all goes, I think you will finish this quite satisfied in that regard. The violence is still there when it comes to this movie, in a brutal way when it comes to some of the things that happen to some of the characters. But with that said, I would say that it's not as much as an onslaught as it was in Part 2. 1978 was just like back to back. The brutality, the acts, all of that was going on was just so like in your face, brutal and graphic. And this movie, yes, the violence is still there, but I would say it's more along the lines of perhaps what the first movie was giving us, where yes, there is violence, but it's not as much back to back to back in that regard. Now, do I think it's as scary as Part 2 was? Because if you had seen my previous two reviews, then you know that I thought Part 2 so far in between 1994 and 1978, that Part 2, 1978, to me was a lot more gruesome and scary and creepy in my opinion. And with Part 3, I would say that it's not as scary. There's a lot of callbacks and references to everything that you have seen in Part 1 and Part 2. Yes, there are some new scares in there, so it does have that. But I would also say, unlike Part 1 and particularly in Part 2, how I felt like those movies could stand on their own, Part 3 definitely plays into you having seen the first two installments. I will say that I didn't particularly care for what I felt was an excessive amount of animal deaths in this third installment. Now, I think it's really in the context of the year that it takes place in regards to some of the things of how the animals die, because, you know, there's more livestock around. So, you know, by standards in that regard, they kind of, if bad things are happening, yeah, the animals sometimes are the first to be the warning sign of things occurring. With that said, though, I didn't think we needed it as much. I felt like they could have alluded to it more. I didn't necessarily need to see it, and maybe that's just my being partial as an animal lover. But I also think at times horror movies can lean a little too much into that trope of, displaying the depravity of a situation by killing the animals. And I just think it's a little cheap. And I think so far, Fear Street, this trilogy, hasn't needed to fall into some of those cheaper tropes of horror that we see. And I was a little disappointed to see that it did in this regard of the animal deaths. If you didn't guess it already, there is definitely a message in this movie. Messages are being given to the audience. Not so much so it's like so obvious necessarily where you feel like you're being preached to, but there is messaging here, and messaging that I appreciated because I think they did a good job of having the balance of the horror with the message that they wanted to get out there. And the kids continue to not be safe. The kids are not safe in this one. Not at all. This one also feels a little slower than the first two. And I didn't mind that because I kind of wanted it to take its time because, there had been this whole buildup of a story. You kind of wanted to take its time to reveal to you what exactly is going on. I wouldn't have wanted them to rush through it. But with that said, I did get used to some of the more quicker pace of the first two installments, that even with their quicker pace, they used every moment to really convey something. And I felt like with this third installment, they definitely were creating more atmosphere than actual things being said at times. My final twisted grade for Fear Street 1666 is an A-. I think it's a great culmination to a very thorough, thrilling horror story that we got from the first two installments. Although I would also say it feels a little bit like the weaker or the weakest of the three.